Welcome back again. This is now the third part of Module 1 on biodiversity in our environmental sustainability course. So we've come a long way so far in our module. We've talked about some of the basic ideas in ecology, and we've also defined the term biodiversity in a roundabout way, and also talked about why biodiversity is important through the ecosystem services they provide to the sustainability of an environment. We're ready to turn to the next part now, which deals more with endangered species. So let's take a look at the issue of conserving biodiversity. As an aside, the whole idea of conservation is something that goes back a long, long time. In its history, it was developed as a movement separate from a preservationist movement. Preservationist people in the turn of the previous century, around 1900, were putting things away and tying them up as untouchable kinds of areas in order to try and preserve the living things that they thought, and landscapes that they thought were both spiritually important and functionally important. And that was in contrast to a movement that became known as conservation, which actually said, well, wise use of resources can be done simply and can complement what might occur by putting really critically threatened areas away, but the vast majority of areas might be better served by managing them appropriately and looking at the wise use of the resources that lie on them, understanding that at some point humans will want to inhabit and make a living of the kinds of resources that exist. So when we look at this area that became known as conservation biology, it has its basis in the idea that biodiversity on the planet for the last 200 years has been declining, and been declining rapidly in the most recent part of our history. If you were to take a graph and just simply look at the size of the human population, you see that somewhere in the middle part of this last century, in the middle 1900s, you had a rapid growth in the human population. On the graph is shown as the blue line, going from a rather more gradual rate of growth to a rapid rate of growth. When you analyze that, inevitably you come to the conclusion that it was because things like the improvement of the conditions in the world, general people of the world, increased sanitation, increased clean water supplies, increased access to medicine that would prevent infant deaths, simple things that would control diarrhea and fever, were introduced into populations worldwide, places where death rates were inordinately high from the diseases and the infections that were prevalent in the populations. And as a sort of guard against that, families were large. People had lots and lots of kids, rural communities in particular, where the value of having lots of kids was directly available because they offered as a workforce to increase the productivity of the farm and the kinds of productions that you might have that would bring into a family. And so when you all of a sudden introduce things like medicines and hygienics that decrease the death rates, but you maintain the high birth rates, lots of surviving babies meant that around the world populations exploded. And this was particularly the case right after the Second World War. And in parts of the world like Central and South America, around the Indonesian and Africa, these numbers became extraordinarily high, and that the survival of children, which is something you can't argue against as a good idea, or an ethical way to behave, created an explosion of a population in the world. And it went from 1 billion people around 1900 up to what we face today, around 8 billion people. And paralleling that was, of course, a pressure on the kinds of lands that people lived on. The islands in the South Pacific that had a small and probably sustainable population on them exploded, and migration took people into cities of Singapore and other places in Indonesia, and they took the same into the large cities in Brazil and the large cities in Africa, and migration away from the land occurred, but there was still a need to support those people, and so increasing natural lands and wild lands became subject to greater and greater amounts of agriculture and simply residential growth into those areas. And there's lots of literature on that as it affected the Amazon. But inevitably, what this meant was that the rates of extinction of species, because of the loss of their homelands, increased dramatically as well. And so the red line on the graph that's on the screen shows an exponential increase in the extinction rates in animals and plants and species around the world. And over that last 200 years, the rate of extinction, which naturally, if you go back in geological time, probably represented something along the line of a species per year or something like that, has become almost 1,000 times higher. And so the real concern of a branch of biology that's called conservation biology is, how do you stop that? How do you put a hold on those sorts of extinction rates? And so the challenge that is faced in this is, how do you slow down that extinction that is natural in, well, extinction is natural, it's always been there as species have changed or failed to change in the case of dinosaurs, as climates have altered. But now what we see is there's a direct line between the rates of extinction, especially these very high rates, and human activities, especially things that directly threaten particular species. So, for example, one of the main causes of extinction that's been able to be identified is overexploitation. In the middle part of the century, what was clear was that the populations of a variety of different marine mammals, particularly the big whales, was falling and falling rapidly. We've seen it in fisheries across the world. They became threatened as a result of commercialization and the development of a technology that could go out into the ocean and catch essentially every anchovy off the coast of Chile. And populations crashed and crashed badly. We saw it in Canada with the almost disappearance of the Atlantic cod population, something that the people of Newfoundland and Labrador have depended upon for centuries, and that Europeans in areas of Spain and Portugal and especially have depended on as well as staples in their diets and a central ingredient in some of their traditional foods, because of the adventurers that came over to North America, sailed onto the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, and were able to catch fish. But with the advent of a technology that allowed factory ships to park off the coast of the Grand Banks and be able to process fish on site, what happened is more and more and smaller and younger fish were taken in enormous abundances, so that by 1992 had established that the cod was on the brink of extinction, and so they stopped entirely a commercial fishery of it on the Grand Banks and within the protected waters of Canada. And what we've seen is, just in the last month, in April of this year, the biologists and fisheries people on the East Coast have determined that the 24 years of fishing has actually allowed some of the population to recover. But that overexploitation that was there quite definitely led the Atlantic cod in Canada to the brink of extinction. Other things that are human activities also result in numbers that can be so low and in fact may result in extinction rates, elevated extinction rates. So for example, the persecution of particular species can lead to the systematic removal of individuals. You don't have to go very much further than rattlesnakes in the South Okanagan. There are very few patches left where you can find natural dens and abundances of rattlesnakes, and part of the reason is that whenever they would appear on somebody's doorstep, a rake was a lot easier to deal with than your dog getting bitten, and so people would kill them. And so with the encroachment of people into areas and the dislike of having to deal with the challenges of these problem wildlife, numbers have declined, and they've hit an endangered list in British Columbia. Badgers are another case where people have dealt with the problematic persistence of badgers in an area and the kind of damage they pursue with systematic poisoning and other regimes to get rid of them. More importantly for badgers, as it turns out, is the impact of traffic, and I'll get to that in a second. Other species are challenged by the pollutants that we put into our atmosphere. This is particularly the case when you take a look at amphibians. Frogs and salamanders have a thin skin. They make their life by being able to live at the interface of air and water, and that thin skin allows them and to be able to do enormously well in places where other species can't. But what it means is that pollutants can cross their skin just as easily as can the oxygen, and so they enter the body. They become targets for pollutants. Many of the pollutants, such as pesticides that don't have any natural counterparts, become concentrated, and because there's no enzyme in the animal's body to get rid of them and break them down, they build up and build up and build up until they finally affect the normal functioning of things. This was particularly the case in birds in the 1960s, when what you had was a buildup of DDT in the environment as a result directly of trying to get rid of mosquito problems. But because it's not got any natural enzymes that break it down, it would concentrate into small organisms, waterways. Those small organisms, the little zooplankton, would be eaten by small fish. The small fish would be eaten by bigger fish. And at every stage, what would happen is, because the concentration couldn't be broken down and diminished, it got higher and higher. And at a certain level, what happened, what happens, is that it can't any longer be tolerated by the body. In the case of DDT, it affected two things. One is a pathway whereby calcium as a nutrient and mineral in your body becomes processed. And it resulted in thinner bones of some species of birds in particular, but more crucially, it ended up with eggshells that were thinner than normal, and that when a mother would sit on them, the egg would crack and it would be infertile. And so osprey and bald eagles and other fish-eating birds in Lake Ontario were extraordinarily threatened at that point because of the pollutants that were in the environment. In 1969, they stopped making DDT in Canada as a direct result of that threat that was in our environment. And so from that point, you've seen a rebound of many of the populations of birds that had been affected by DDT. At a larger level, there is, as we all have seen, a more varied environment. It's a harbinger of climatic conditions changing. There's good evidence to point to the fact that it's an increased rate of emissions of carbon dioxide that are changing the characteristic conditions in our climate that are a direct result of humans and the kinds of increased consumption of oil products and petroleum products and fossil fuels that are resulting in an increased layer of carbon dioxide and other gases in the environment that trap the heat close to the earth. And so changing climatic conditions has changed the rate at which spring comes. I've seen it myself in my own lifetime. And that so much of nature is dependent upon a close timing of when you can get in, when you can breed, and when you have to migrate away, that especially in the northern climates, this is becoming a critical thing. And so species numbers are declining, specifically in relation to some of the changed climatic conditions and seasonal changes that are occurring. Of course, we also, when we change things in physical ways, we open up opportunities for things that weren't there before. So some of the competing and invasive plant species that particularly have been brought to North America, often by accident, sometimes on purpose, sometimes they're escapes from garden variety of gone wild and gone feral. They can compete directly with the native species for the kinds of resources they need to grow, and they can crowd them out. You can see it in a variety of different places in the southern part of British Columbia where knapweed is caught hold and continues to be a huge problem in certain regions. You don't have to go much from a bird example of the starling. And in the case of the starling, it was brought on purpose so that somebody could have all the birds that were mentioned in Shakespeare and that were part of Britain in North America. And they released a few in Central Park in New York City, and that was it. From that, the entire population of bluebirds, or of starlings in North America, grew to the point where they were crowding bluebirds out of their boxes and nest holes. And so the whole nest box program that exists in grasslands now related by that competition that these nasty starlings would be able to affect on wild populations of hole nesting species. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, is the general loss and deterioration of habitat. As humans have settled areas, as there has been a change in the kinds of roadways and other things that put into areas to gain access to the resources we are after for development, what we find is that the landscape becomes fragmented, that some species will avoid the crossing of roads. Female grizzly bears are a classic example of this. And other ones, when they do cross the roads, become fatalities, and that's probably the biggest issue with regard to the largest loss in badgers in British Columbia. But amphibians and all sorts of things are killed along roadways. The other things that can cause the deterioration of habitat include things like a too great and too rapid development of areas for forestry, such that not enough is left on a landscape in different successional stages so that it reflects the kinds of natural disturbances that are there. And so the deterioration of habitats that come as a result of that can be particularly threatening to species. In the case of one that is right around the interior here, there's a bird called Lewis's woodpecker, and Lewis's woodpecker is a pink woodpecker, believe it or not, and it flies around and catches insects on the wing. You may have seen it, and it loves to nest in the hollows, makes in big trees, usually big dead trees, things like the cottonwoods that are along the riverbanks and big old ponderosa pine in the southern interior here. And one of the problems is those trees and those types of trees become dangerous to us, and so we remove them from the landscape because of our own fear of being crushed by or having our property destroyed by them. And so with the disappearance of those features of the landscape, habitat isn't as good anymore, and so the loss and deterioration of that habitat has led to the decline in the numbers of Lewis's woodpeckers to the point where they're a species that's threatened in British Columbia and at specific risk of going extinct. So those sorts of activities are things that are undeniable and things that we have to take care of and pay attention to. We have developed an act of our national government that takes care of species or is aimed at protecting and keeping and preventing wildlife species from disappearing. It is written to provide for the recovery of species that have been identified and that identified as being endangered or as a result of human activity, and to manage habitats, particularly for those that haven't reached the brink but are of special concern to keep them from becoming endangered or threatened. And the way this is done is that a particular species will be nominated as a result of all the work of our government officials and scientists and members of the public who've noted declines in particular abundance of a species. It'll go to a scientific panel who will request and fund a study of the abundance and the changes that have occurred, and then on the basis of that scientific evidence we'll either decide that a species should be listed or shouldn't be listed, and we'll decide at what level it should be listed. The things that actually trigger a species becoming listed as endangered are things like declines in the population of more than 50% over a 10-year period, or changes in the distribution of a species such that where it used to be abundant is now it becomes restricted to a very small pinpoint on a map, so that just random changes, bad storms or fires or other event could remove the last individuals from the population. And so the group that makes those decisions is called COSEWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, and it makes those decisions as to what status a species might have, and then on the basis of that establishes rules and other sorts of conditions under which those species have to be given special consideration. And one of the big questions that arose, especially during the development of that legislation, was what are the responsibilities of private landowners under this Species at Risk Act? And so that's going to be the subject of our third assignment. And now here's the third assignment. It generally will talk about what are the conservation responsibilities of private landowners under this Canada Species Act, or SARA. What would be good to do, I think, is for all of us to take a look at a species that you may have on your own property that might be considered at risk, and then to talk about what the responsibilities you would have on it. We're going to meet on the 6th of May, and we're going to do a little bit of a field tour and some other things to take a look at some of the ideas that I've been talking about this course so far. And what I'd like to do is to have a discussion over lunch. And so if everybody went and took a look at what constitutes species at risk in their area and what sort of things, what species, take one species for example. If you got badgers on your property, you might go and take a look and say, okay, what are the habitat requirements for a badger? What is this badger's niche? And then in the context of that, what are the requirements of this legal legislation for me as a private landowner to take care of that species and to try and prevent its extinction? So if we have that as our discussion over lunch, I think it might be a very interesting one. In order to take a look and see if you might have a species that would be one of the listed species, you can go to the website that I've got listed on the previous page. It's under, you could just go to COSEWIC if you Google it and go to the Canadian government page, and what you'd be able to find is a list of all the species at risk, and if you sort of sift through it, you can find something that you might be familiar with or be surprised by, or you might just take something that would be interesting to you. So for example, the mountain caribou that I talked about before is listed as an endangered species under the Species at Risk Act. Some species you'll see are extirpated. Burrowing owls were extirpated from BC because they couldn't find a wild population. Now they're thinking of making them endangered because although there are some wild individuals now being found breeding, we don't know how many there are. There's too many uncertainties, so they're classified as endangered. So there's things like that, and if everybody, species or a couple of species, found out about their biology and what their responsibilities are, we might have a very interesting discussion. Okay, so we're almost there. We've got down to discussing the challenges that ranching faces regarding biodiversity, and we're down to the very last bit. And I'm going to take a break for a second and we'll come back.